Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm David Huberman. I currently work at ICANN, though please forgive me for that. I have been an operator for much of my career. I want to talk today a little bit about reverse DNS and then specifically take a look at some numbers in the UK. Next slide, please. So there's not a lot of statistics out there. There's not a lot of common measurements about reverse DNS, or none that I'm exposed to. And these days, I hang out with a lot of DNS specialists, a lot of people who think full time about DNS. And one of the refrains I hear quite often is that when they look at PTR records, they just assume they're obsolete. And that makes sense because there's some of you in the audience, especially at ISPs, who, you enjoy a fully functioning OSS. And everything just works quite nicely as customers are turned up and turned down. Some of you have DNS provisioning software, which is well integrated into your IPAM. Okay, that's great. For 90%, pretty much of the rest of the world, PTR records are typically a kind of a set it and forget it type of technology. And a lot of them can go obsolete quite quickly and be there for a very long time. So I wanted to take a look at where things were at. This is my first iteration of my tool. And so what I did is I wrote some software in Python to first grab all of the IP address delegation information from each of the RIRs. Importantly, it's 2022, right? So we're looking today at reverse DNS in the United Kingdom. I don't only just look at the NCC. It's always been the case that there are one-offs here and there to countries from other RIRs where you wouldn't expect them to be. But especially in 2022 with a very vibrant secondary market, we want to make no assumptions. So the first thing I do is I look for all of the UK delegations at all of the 5 RIRs. And when I do this, by the way, this is where I learned that ISO 3166, which is what sets those 2-digit country codes that we all use, for some reason thinks the United Kingdom is abbreviated as GB. That was a little interesting to me. After I grab all the information about the delegations and then isolate them for the country code that I want to look at, I then go compare them against a copy of the DFZ that is published by our friends at Links. And that way I can separate those that are routed and those which are not. Then I go look for PTR records. This turned out to be my biggest challenge because the first thing I did, of course, is I set up a scanner. I would take a block, I would scan for the PTR records in the block, and if I found at least one PTR record, I would mark the block as having some reverse DNS. And if I found none, I would mark it as having none. The problem is I couldn't make this thing go very fast. A fairly typical sized developed country would take a full day to scan through all of the CIDR blocks. And that just took too long, especially if I want to do really large countries or if I wanted to do more global studies. I got lucky and I found a research organization called Rapid7, which does a weekly publication of all of the PTR records in all of the IPv4 address space. I was able to get access to that, and I used that data. And finally, I do an intersection of all that data, which is going to be the next slide. And really, the goal of this first iteration is just to take a look at where we're at for each country, and then just use it as an excuse to talk about reverse DNS. Next slide, please. So as of Friday, when I put these measurements together, here's what we have in the UK. So first off, there were just under 8,000 IPv4 allocations registered in the UK, but they're not all on bit. For those 7,985 allocations, there are actually 8,144 CIDR blocks, and that's what we look at. Except I ignored 13 of them. 13 of them are for some sort of microinfrastructures or used for some internal use under policy. And they're smaller than 24, and I'm not going to find them in Links' copy of the DFC, so I throw those out. So here's what's left. And there are four values. The first one's the good one. 65% of the CIDRs registered in the UK are routed and have at least one PTR record in them. Okay, good. Also a perfectly normal number, routed in the DFC, but with no PTR records anywhere, because perhaps it's not relevant to that block, is about 14%. These two numbers are just a little bit smaller than other developed nations. I haven't done a full statistical analysis, but just empirically, they're about 4 to 5% lower than I expect, than I see at other really well-developed economies. Then come the two kind of interesting ones. First off, these are the ones that my DNS friends like to rant about. These are the ones that are not routed, and yet there are still PTR records present. This is about 9%, and this is a very, very common number. About 9 or 10% of every economy that I've looked at so far has space that's not routed and still has PTR records present. And finally, if you're in this last category, you may want to go talk to Lee Howard in the audience. These are blocks that are not in the DFC. They don't have any PTR, and in the general case are probably not in use. So that's what the UK looked like as of Friday. Make two quick comments. First off, you'll notice I've only talked about IPv4 during this brief presentation. That's because I couldn't figure out how to make IPv6 work. The address space is enormous. Statistical sampling wasn't helpful because the address space was too large for me to figure out a way to sample it. Pure scanning, of course, was impossible. I don't have enough machines with enough cores and enough time to do that. So I couldn't figure out IPv6. And if you happen to think of any ways you could do DNS scanning over large IPv6 blocks and then do them for an entire country or for the entire world, I'd love to buy you a coffee. And then the other thing I wanted to say with my remaining seconds is we're network engineers here, and many of us are working at ISPs, and it's really useful when you're doing manual troubleshooting, when you as a human are doing network troubleshooting. It's really useful when our peers have tagged all their network infrastructure elements with PTR records. Because when we're looking at a traceroute or tools like traceroute that honor PTR records, it really is quite helpful when we're able to look at the whole picture and see those airport codes. When you see a border router at LHR, you know what you're looking at, okay? And as network engineers, both for those in your company in the NOC and for those of your fellow network engineers all around the world who are doing troubleshooting to your network, I think it's quite useful if you would please consider tagging all your network infrastructure elements with PTR records. Next slide, please. And that's all I had. Hope you found that a little bit interesting. This summer, in June, I'm actually going to present a survey of the entire world, and it'll be interesting to see what kind of measurements I get out of that. That's all I had to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. Now, I think there's a question in the room already, so come on up, introduce yourself and ask away.
Hi, David. It's nice to meet you. My name's Lee Howard from IPv4.global. And I wrote an RFC 8501. I had to go look up the number on reverse DNS considerations in IPv6. And I talked about some of the reasons that you might want or not care about PTRs. For v6 lookups, did you look at, for instance, whether there was did you look for lane delegation? Obviously, you can't do a PTR check on every possible reverse record, but you could look for an NS record on the IP6.ARPA zone. You could do a PTR lookup on ::1 and see if there's something there. See if it actually, if you get there's a difference between no response and a null response. Those kinds of questions.
Yeah, that's a good point. What I didn't know is ::1. Are operators using that today in the same way we used, .1 in IPv4? I wasn't sure how those are being deployed today, especially for network infrastructure elements.
Yeah, it's a fair question. We'd want to go poll the operators, and I think that commonly reserving, some of the sort of fun named networks or subnets those are the ones you kind of want to use for your infrastructure, because I know that one of the objections I keep hearing to IPv6 is, oh, but I can't remember that many digits. And then people get, oh, if all I have to do is remember, 2460:2000:4, I can probably remember that many digits. And so they start to use the really, the earliest in their /32. That's sort of, it's a rough first approximation. I wouldn't rely on it, but it'd be a sort of first approximation to get a sense for, again, at least is there a name server registered and is it actually responding to queries?
Yeah, I really like that idea, Lee. I wish I had thought of it, but thank you for that. That actually gives me good information for a first pass at trying to do IPv6. Thank you.
Thanks.
Do we have any other questions in the room? We do. Rob's on his way up.
Hi, Rob Evans from the UKNOF49 network. Did you look at the pre-RIR address space?
Yes, I take this is the entire registered IPv4 for everybody.
Okay, and apologies if you covered this on slide 2. Were you looking for at least one PTR within the whole block, or more than 50, or?
Yeah, so what I did was, I can't make assumptions about, when I find a PTR record, I can't make any assumption about whether or not it's obsolete or whether it's active and relevant. So what I did is for each CIDR that exists in a for delegation, if it has a single PTR record, if there's a /20 assigned to, some ISP somewhere, if there's at least one PTR found, I stop, count the entire /20 as yes, and move on to the next one.
Okay, thanks.
Do we have any questions from the web chat? Nothing at all. Just give it... Oh, are you coming up for one more? Yeah, please do. Oh yeah, we have time.
Hi, David. I thought of more questions. Lee Howard again. It's an interesting potential evolution would be once you find a record to test that record and see if forward matches reverse. I don't know what that tells me, but I'm really curious about how often that they do match. I heard somebody scoff behind me, I think. And then also you said you're using this as an excuse to talk to operators about reverse DNS, and I'm very curious about what you'd like to talk about reverse DNS. Other than traceroute, is there a key application that you think it's great for?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, yes, of course, it's where it's most useful and most important is this dinosaur known as email. But I'm assuming everybody already knows that, right? I mean, mail is not new, and mail administrators aren't a full-time thing anymore. I hope everybody knows that when you're setting up an email server, it's really important you put the mail server's host name into reverse DNS, because that's a very common and important anti-spam tool to check the reverse DNS match to the forward DNS. I'm assuming everybody knows that when I talk to network operator groups. So really the only thing I want to say is I hate looking through network troubleshooting tools and seeing IP addresses instead of host names with IATA codes on them.
Yeah.
Because I'm a human, right? And when I'm looking at an entire network path, it really helps to visualize it if I've got clues. And we've used IATA codes for 30 years because they're really useful to humans. And really that's all I could find that was really useful about reverse DNS.
Until you remember part of your regional network and then the codes are all wrong because you didn't update your PTR records.
Yes.
Not that I would ever do that, of course.
Do that.
Never had that problem.
Just before the last question, can I remind people, please do tick the Mattermost polls for rating the talks. It really helps the programme committee and the rest of the UKNOF team understand how talks have been received.
David, hi. Yeah, Tom Hill from BT. I couldn't not say anything after that last point made about email. I recently had to deal with a ticket, which I don't know how it ended up getting to me, but it was a question that had come up probably a million times a day 10 years ago, and I haven't heard the same question asked recently, and no one else seemed to have remembered what the problem was. When emails being sent from devices like printers and things like that behind residential residential IP addresses, half the MTAs in the world look at the common BT centralplus.com RDNS and go, no, it's a DSL line, go away. Reality is you can't send email from half of these places already, and we don't offer static RDNS for this. And when you start talking about IPv6, it really starts begging the question, who is sending email from these IP addresses, and should we actually let them, and can they do it currently? Because I think most cases they can't, unless you're in an enterprise setting where for some reason someone still doesn't have a properly hosted configured NTA, and they can still have a static RDNS. Realistically, I don't see a benefit for RDNS on consumer addresses. The infrastructure leading up to it, yes, but not for their RDNS, or at the very least, some auto-generated address, and that's that. It's done. So, I mean, I like the whole email thing. It blows my mind because I can't believe we still think about this in this context. I don't know why we need it. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just shaking my head. I'm agreeing.
Thank you. Thank you for all your questions, and thank you, David, for your talk.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everybody.